you've written recently about heat pumps. And while these have been around for a while as a flagship net zero policy, uptake hasn't been very high, and probably most people don't really know what they are. So first of all, I mean, what are they? Are they any good? And what's the government's latest ruse for trying to get everyone to install them?
Okay, so a heat pump is essentially a way of collecting heat from the environment and pumping it into your home. On the face of it, it looks like a very clever technology, because essentially you put in 1 unit of energy and you might get 3 units of heat out. So, it's almost like getting something for nothing. So in terms of our energy demand, it reduces energy demand a lot. But there's a big but. The problem is that electricity currently costs something like 4 times the price of gas. So even though you're using 3 times less energy, you're actually spending more money because the price of energy is so high. And that is one of the major problems with getting people to take up heat pumps. There are other problems too, though. Buying a heat pump is much more expensive than a gas boiler. And also, if you're going to install a heat pump, you probably also need to replace all your radiators. They'll need bigger radiators, and possibly even underfloor heating. And that costs a lot of money too. So they've also had a pretty bad press because I think a lot of them people haven't installed big enough heat pumps. The problem with heat pumps is when the weather's cold and there isn't so much heat that can be collected, their efficiency goes down quite a lot, and people have complained that their houses are being left really cold. Now, you can counter that by having a much bigger heat pump, but that's obviously much more expensive. So there's been a lot of resistance to people getting them. The targets that the government has set, now obviously the government targets, they're plucked out of the air, but they're not being met by a long chalk. So what the government, what the Green Blob, if you like, has proposed is changing the price of electricity, reducing the price of electricity and increasing the price of gas, so that the equation moves more in favor of heat pumps. This was an idea that has been around for quite a long time, but with the new government in place, the Climate Change Committee put out a report which said we need to reduce the price of electricity, and that's been picked up across the Green Blob, if you like. So across social media, we've seen green bloggers and commentators saying we need to do this. Energy UK, which is like a trade body, has also said we need to do this. So what they're going to do, or what they want to do, is to move all the subsidy costs for wind farms and so on off electricity bills and onto gas bills. Now, there's a number of problems with this. The first thing is that if you increase the price of gas, then, gas sets prices in the electricity market for reasons I'm not going to go into. But if you increase the price of gas, then the price of electricity will go up. So it's kind of self-defeating to some extent. But perhaps more alarmingly, if you put the price of gas up, then people won't be able to afford to heat their homes, because most people heat their homes with gas. So, essentially, we will get many more people dying of cold in the winter. And that's a fairly serious problem. Obviously, putting the price of gas up will also be bad for industry. So we'll probably get job losses. So the whole thing is rather awkward. I've spoken to some people who say, they will tout this idea around, but it won't happen. But you just don't know with Ed Miliband, because Ed Miliband is nothing if not a fanatic. If he gets his own way, I think it will happen and it will be a disaster. And we're kind of hoping, if you like, that Rachel Reeves just says, no, don't be so daft. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah. And so on that net zero transition that's being pushed by people like Ed Miliband more widely, obviously there's this push towards heat pumps and also electric cars. And both of those things will require a lot more electricity. But as you mentioned, electricity is very expensive in Britain. So Will we be able to cope with all this additional electricity demand?
There's a lot of different questions in there in reality. So the first thing is, will there be enough electricity? And of course, you can build more wind farms and more solar farms or whatever, which will give you more electricity. But sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and just building more capacity won't solve that problem. We haven't solved the energy storage problem, which is one of the ways that we're meant to deal with this. There is no viable technology for storing electricity on the scale that's required. We had a report out just today, actually, from the National Audit Office saying that carbon capture and storage, which is the other proposal for dealing with this problem, I mean, it looks like a complete non-starter. We're pouring tens of billions of pounds into it, and essentially it's not working. The projects are all far behind schedule and, will probably fail. So the first thing, I guess, is, we probably won't have enough electricity to do this. But the other aspect of it is that have we got the capacity in the wires that carry the electricity to homes to deal with this? Essentially, the UK has two grids, if you like. There's the transmission grid, which is like the backbone of the system, and National Grid are making positive noises. They're kind of suggesting that they will be able to cope with this. There's quite a lot of redundancy built into the system anyway. So they're suggesting they're going to be okay. The distribution grid, which takes the electricity actually at a more local level, actually along streets and to homes, they have a big problem because all those wires, or certainly in urban areas, all the wires are buried and they're going to need upgraded. And they need to be upgraded quite a lot because I alluded to this before. When it's cold, the efficiency of the heat pump goes down, and so they need a lot more electricity to deliver the same amount of heat. So on cold days, you're going to get this huge surge of power, which is going to mean we're going to need much bigger cables under the streets. So essentially, we're going to need to dig up every urban street in the country to upgrade them. Now, National Grid has put out an estimate of the cost. They did this in 2020, and they're talking about something of the order of £500 billion to do all the upgrades required. It's a huge sum of money. It's going to take decades. So the idea that this is going to be in place for 2030, which is Ed Miliband's claim, is frankly for the birds. I mean, the whole of net zero policy is being built around fantasy. They're just making it up as they go along. They're shouting out targets, and it's going to be a failure, and it's going to be really very, very serious for the economy.
Yes, and so there's a lot of pie in the sky thinking there, as you mentioned. And of course, for the past year, we've had a Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. This was, of course, created by the Conservatives. And doesn't that itself kind of capture a lot of the oxymoronic thinking here? I mean, it's almost like having a department for health and heart attacks, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, it is completely oxymoronic. The problem is, if you're talking in terms of sort of national security, then renewables net zero is pretty disastrous. We're reliant very much on essentially hostile powers for all the technology that is deployed for net zero. We have all this offshore infrastructure in the shape of offshore wind farms that, a hostile power could cut us off in the space of a couple of weeks just by cutting the cables. And we know that the Russians have submarines that are equipped to do this. So, that's a real problem. The only way to get national security is to have onshore energy production, which means fracking, and it means coal. Onshore wind farms, perhaps, but once you get onto the other aspect of energy security, which is to say, is the energy supply going to always be there? Well, no, it's not. We have this. The problem with the intermittency of renewables, and this hasn't been solved. We've already talked about that. People don't realize how big a problem this is. If you're running a grid based on solar. It's much easier because solar is much more reliable and predictable than wind. Wind can disappear for weeks at a time in what's called a Dunkelflaute, when there is no wind at all in the middle of winter, and therefore it's middle of winter, so there's no solar power as well, and you essentially get perhaps 2 or even 3 weeks at a time where essentially you can produce no power. But interestingly, this is actually a secondary problem. The big problem with wind is you get what are called wind drought years. We had one in 2021, I think it was, when wind production in the UK was down 20%. Now, if you're running your grid on essentially on wind power alone, the amount of energy you've got to store to deal with that is unbelievable. I mean, if you did it with batteries, you're talking tens of trillions of pounds of batteries that need to be replaced every sort of 15, 20 years or something. You could do it with hydrogen, but again, the cost is astronomical with hydrogen. So this is essentially an insoluble problem. To come back to the original question, energy security doesn't go with net zero. If you're going to try and do net zero, you are not going to have energy security of any kind.
Absolutely. So let's talk about net zero as a political idea. So, of course, there were a few minor anti-net zero noises made by the past Conservative government, but a lot of those MPs are now out in any case. And, of course, as we mentioned, Ed Miliband and Labour are very much committed to it. However, we do have the entrance of 5 new Reform MPs into Parliament. And it was quite refreshing to see during their campaign that they weren't just saying, maybe we should push net zero back to, say, 2040 or something. They were actually saying, no, we should scrap it entirely. And, this was a completely different voice in Parliament. So how do you think the politics of net zero are going to play out in this new Parliament?
Yeah, the advent of the 5 Reform MPs has been very refreshing. Ever since we started off on the decarbonisation journey sort of years ago under David Cameron, and even before that, there has been this sort of rather unhealthy consensus in Westminster. Although we've had some sceptical voices on the Conservative benches, they've been kept pretty quiet. I mean, I think it's been made fairly clear to them that if they spoke out on it, then their political careers were going to be short and stunted. And I think although a lot of those sceptical voices did lose out in the general election, there are a few left. A lot of the sort of very green voices have gone too, but again, there are still some left. My impression is that the Conservative Party remains divided on this issue and doesn't really want to go further than they did in the general election campaign of we're going to do net zero, but we're going to do it better. That was the message that they gave. So to have the Reform MPs in Parliament now actually asking the difficult questions and, shouting about the complete absurdities of net zero is going to be very healthy for our democracy. I think, it is going to put the issue front and center. I mean, Reform, I think, are going, they give the impression they're going to major on immigration rather than net zero. But if, even if net zero is like the second string argument, I think it will still be very important. It will be very different to what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years.
Yes, absolutely. And just more widely on that, do you feel the public have been rather excluded from this debate? Obviously, as we mentioned, the political class often seem pretty much united on it. I mean, there was the famous 2019 net zero debate when they actually brought in the legislation, which only lasted about 90 minutes and was pretty much ignored by everyone. But, would you like to see the public more involved in this? And perhaps, some people have even suggested a referendum on net zero. Certainly,
the public have definitely been excluded from this. I mean, there has been almost no media discussion of the problems with net zero, apart from perhaps the Mail and the Telegraph. Broadcast media has been almost silent on it. So we're in a new world now where, okay, we're going to see it discussed in Parliament, and we've got organisations like Daily Sceptic discussing it, and I think this sort of independent media, if you like, are showing quite a lot of interest in the subject too, although perhaps, they're a bit nervous about the technicalities of it. So, to get a public debate, I think is going to be very good and very important. My own view on the referendum is that it's certainly not an issue for the near term, because I think the public has had 2 decades of being misled about the issues. So you probably wouldn't win it anyway. But also, net zero is not really a constitutional issue, and I think referenda are probably best kept for constitutional issues. This is just something where a sensible government will just say, we can't do this. That's going to happen anyway. The problems with net zero are becoming so pressing, and the costs so absurd that governments are going to have to turn away from it simply because they can't afford it any longer. One of the things I've been writing about recently is the fact that we are likely to see electricity bills surging in coming years because essentially we've got too much wind power on the grid already. There are times when the wind is blowing hard, when essentially prices on the market go negative, and so what that means is that wind farms have to earn their keep at other times of the day, other times of the year, and what this means is that the price of electricity is going to surge. So that's all going to be rather unpleasant for everybody. And I think governments are going to turn away from the issue, probably under this government is my guess.
Right. So do you think that with Ed Miliband sort of going all guns blazing on net zero here, that's going to set him on a collision course in terms of economic prudence with Rachel Reeves, and that he's perhaps going to lose out in that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Ed Miliband will surge ahead, but the financial pain that he is going to cause will mean that alarm bells are going to start ringing fairly soon in the Treasury. The Treasury are going to have to rein him in, and it may be that he's just being given enough rope to hang himself with at the moment. Obviously Miliband is from a different wing of the party to Mr. Starmer, and Mr. Starmer may well actually want to be rid of him. So once the pain starts being felt, I think we will probably see a change at the helm of the energy department.